Absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our third segment, we just got a comment from 1777 Memorabilia. I think Rangers will need to add an arm approaching the trade deadline, and they could be right there with the Yankees. I agree with you. I feel that they have certain pitchers in this staff that can get the job done. They re-signed Nathan Eovaldi, and they have middle of the rotation guys that they can rely upon. Maybe Andrew Heaney and John Gray step up. But I do think that if health is a big question in this pitching rotation, they could look to add an arm once the trade deadline goes around and they feel they're in a good spot where they're contending in the AL West and potentially for a top seed in the AL side of the bracket. So that's a fantastic point because I don't necessarily think the Rangers are that far away. But now we transition into the world of college basketball. Crazy weekend that ensued this past one in men's college basketball that led to a little bit of a shakeup in the AP polls, and I wanted to bring that to your attention. Always fun talking men's college basketball, especially during this time of year, and especially these teams, because these teams are going to be the focal point of, discussions surrounding who could be the teams to beat in March Madness. So without further ado, let's talk about the latest AP poll in terms of the top 5. Coming in at number 5, Tennessee. And this number 5 position could go to a number of different teams. Potentially, if you're a big fan of Houston, as 1777 said, great topics. Thank you, my friend. I love talking about both of these sports. They're near and dear to my heart. But men's college basketball, especially at this time of year, gets really exciting. But getting into the Tennessee Volunteers, always a team, in my opinion, that's going to contend, right? And like I said, this number 5 spot could be up for debate because Houston is playing so well, but just the power of the SEC this year, man. You can't deny the fact that SEC teams look damn impressive. And Tennessee, one of the best defensive teams in the country. Over the past couple of weeks, they have one of the worst losses in the country to Kentucky, but that just goes to show how big the SEC is this year. As 1777 says, lots of love for the SEC this year, but in the tournament they tend to choke. I want to wait and see, but I do agree with that statement. But for now, it's the cream of the crop. And Tennessee, could be one of those teams that people get iffy about in the tournament. But right now, they're playing elite defensively, have one of the best wins in the country against Florida, holding them at 44 points. But they did lose to Kentucky, so you can see that Jekyll and Hyde mentality to them. But I believe that if Chaz Lanier gets going, he'll be the next Dalton Knecht. And Zakai Ziegler is one of the best point generals in the land. Kind of reminds me of, if you remember, UCLA's Tyler Campbell and how he handles the position. I really like him on both ends of the floor. Very rarely do we see a point guard play both ways so passionately. So I like the complexion of this Tennessee team, but their days could be numbered in terms of the top 5, just because Houston is just gone about their business so beautifully, but because of the fact they're in the Big 12, maybe a bit more understated than the performances of Tennessee in the past couple of weeks. But nonetheless impressive to any Houston Cougars fans out there, and we could potentially see them in a couple weeks' time. Then let's go into the confusion here, kind of where everything gets muddled up. Both Duke and Florida were tied for 3rd in the latest AP polls, but I think that Florida might have overtaken Duke, but let's talk about Duke right now, because Duke is taking care of business down the stretch of the season against the opponents they should beat. They've beaten Stanford, Cal, and Virginia in dominant fashion. Cooper Flagg's playing the best basketball of not just any freshman in the country, but any player in the country. Kamon Malwalk's rounding into his own. Tyrese Proctor holding it down at the point guard position. Con Kneppel, kind of still a little bit more Jekyll and Hyde than I like him to be, but I think he's going to grow into the season. He's had impressive performances thus far, but ultimately, I think that this team's going to be asked a lot of questions come March Madness time, and these freshmen especially are going to have to answer them. So I feel that this Duke team, the sky's the limits for them, but they're going to need to continue to prove that they can take steps forward to where the freshmen might not have to be the problem in the tournament, if you know what I mean. I feel like this Duke Blue Devils team could go further than even the Zion Williamson, R.J. Barrett teams of old, but it's going to have to come down to all these players peaking at the right time. And I still believe that Duke, at the very least, could spell Final Four potential, but I'm going to have to start asking more questions of guys like Kneppel, guys like Malwak. And now that Malik Brown is injured, that could be a little bit dangerous in terms of how this team defensively projects over the next couple of weeks in their conference tournament. Could be trouble for Duke. Also, they don't rebound well on offense, says 1777 memorabilia. I've seen that in the couple of games that I have seen of Duke, and that concerns me. They're not necessarily the biggest squad on paper, and they do certainly rely more on defense than, shockingly, offense at this point in time. But I choose to believe that this Duke team is going to grow into the season. At least I hope, because we all know the traits that guys like Kneppel and Malwak hold and how they can develop. So I'm holding out hope that Cooper Flagg is not going to have to be the superstar come March Madness, but it remains to be seen whether or not I can truly trust the depth pieces in this Duke roster. Whereas for Florida, I love how everything is coming together for this team. I love that they have one of the best front courts in the entire country with Tommy Haw, Alex Condon, Micah Hanlockton. Don't forget about him, injured all of last year, finally getting an opportunity to play big minutes for this Florida team, and most underrated point guards in the country in Walter Clayton Jr. I love this Florida Gators roster. Just consistently, ever since that loss to Tennessee, just putting up astounding performance after astounding performance, and I feel like this team can't go understated in the SEC. This might be the team that a lot of people hinge their hopes on and either overexceeds expectations or underperforms in the tournament, in my opinion. And here's the reason why. Last year, I feel like Florida's problem was they could outscore anybody. But, as Andre says, Thomas Haw is him, and I completely agree. And 1777 memorabilia said Florida might be the best team in the country. But here's where I have certain misgivings about them, let's say. Last year, I think Florida's problem was that even though, as Andre continues to say, I'm so hyped for March Madness, I love talking about it too. But here's my thing about Florida. I feel like Florida's problem last year was that they could outscore anybody. They consistently got scored on. This year, I kind of potentially see the opposite happening. As much as I love this front court, as much as I love Walter Clayton Jr. as a perimeter threat, maybe this team will become too reliant on certain players putting the ball in the basket and not necessarily focus in on playing a well-rounded offensive game. And I feel that in March Madness, there are going to be a lot of teams that want to test you in transition, speed up the game. If you say you're a team like Florida expecting to be a number one seed and you're going up against a smaller team. As Andre says, I don't trust that backcourt when it gets gritty. So I say that this team needs to focus more on how clutch they can be. Because if they are clutch in the tournament, then I do believe that they can win this thing. And I feel that they have the players and talent, but it all just needs to come together in that tournament-style format. And I just don't know if I can trust them enough. But because of how flawed it's starting to get at the top of the rankings, no one team really separating themselves from others, I think that they have a legitimate shot at winning the tournament. Let's get into those top two teams who actually played this weekend. Number 2, Alabama, fortunately took the L. Just, in my opinion, I saw a little bit of this game just chucking up too many threes. There wasn't the game for them to really try and beat Auburn by the 3. I think that Nate Oates had to diversify the game plan a little bit more. I know this team lives and dies by the three, and when they get hot from deep, they are one of the hottest teams in the country, especially in terms of how they rate offensively. But it was not the game, especially at home, against that Auburn team. And that's why even when Johnny Broome went down, I just think that this Alabama team can sometimes become too one-dimensional. And I really thought that this year they would take actually a step forward defensively as well because of Grant Nelson's play in last year's tournament. But I'm starting to see the same problems where they kind of get overwhelmed in the interior. And I feel like that will come back to bite them because this is starting to become kind of like the Florida situation like I described when last year they could outscore anybody, they could get scored on by anybody. And Alabama could potentially be that team. But I just feel that they have the quality. Chris Youngblood's proven he can be a competent player off the bench. Sears is still, in my opinion, potentially the best point guard in all of college basketball. But I feel like they're just going to have to rely too much on their scoring, and that's going to come back to bite them. And it did against Auburn. And this team, man, even without Johnny Broome, potentially going to be the Wooden Award winner. Potentially, because Flagg carries his team, as we've mentioned before. But Johnny Broome, even in his absence, this team is just incredible. So much depth, both in the front court and the back court. When Johnny Broome goes down, Chaney Johnson steps in. Dahad Pettiford, the impressive freshman, whom I'm very familiar with as someone who was in that Catholic school basketball when he was at Hudson Catholic Circle and kind of knew about him a little bit. Guys like Chad Baker-Mazzara, Denver Jones, Miles Kelly being really impressive over the past couple of weeks. Just so much depth in this roster. And overwhelmed Alabama. Alabama tried to play their game. Auburn says, well, we'll just play it better because we don't just shoot threes. We can win with perimeter shooting, but also in the interior as well. And they're the most well-rounded team. As Andre says, I don't know if anyone can really beat them once they get into the tournament format because of how dominant they are. But that is the top 5 as of right now. Let me continue to know what your thoughts are. As 1717 in my memorabilia mentions Florida, I would love to see that game. I would love to see that game in a neutral site, two of the best front courts in the nation going at it, and I think that it could be a potentially very special final game of the season. But who knows? That will just about conclude it, though, for this segment. Coming up next, though, we are going to be transitioning to a game in the NBA that will be defined not for the teams playing in it, but for a trade. You'll see what it is after this short break.